Good morning, everybody. You're good. Welcome to Plugged Into History. This is On the Farm with Bob, our agriculturalist extraordinaire. And he's going to talk to us a little bit today about spring planting, both in terms of planting rice, which is going to be the main focus, continuing the conversation with Jeff from yesterday. Talking a little bit about how the planting of rice and the duties of the enslaved workers in terms of, for the big house, contrasts with the spring planting that they may have been doing or were certainly doing for themselves in kitchen gardens. So we're so glad that you're here. Thanks for being plugged into history with us, and thank you so much for helping us continue our mission of connecting people with the past. So, all right, Bob, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. How y'all doing? As you know, my name's Bob. I work with all the historic agriculture here. And we're just outside what we call our Perry House, named after Anna Perry. It's our office here in the Stableyards, but we also make use of it for kind of a demonstration plot. We talk about some of the crops that were grown historically. And frankly, we're renovating our rice field this year, so we're going to grow a little rice up here as well. It's pretty important to our mission. Of course, one time South Carolina produced millions and millions of tons of rice. Not so much anymore. So we like to have folks at least see the stuff. It's pretty amazing. A lot of folks just seeing some of these crops are like, oh, is that what that is? Or, oh, is that how you grow that? Or peanuts, cotton, all that stuff fascinates people. So that's another part of what we're doing out here. So a little bit about our little plot here. We've got some things going. We've got some different herbs. We've got, of course, some leftovers, some winter crop here, cabbage and collard greens. And collard greens, just open-headed cabbages. And they've been under a little bit of predation. We don't have, they're not deer, they're not any of that stuff. It's actually between chickens and peacocks. Peafowl, I should say. Yeah, the fowl love these leaves. They love to chew them up, so they've been chewed up pretty good. And as I always say, Mother Nature gets her cut. So just the other side of our collards, we do have okra growing as well. I even got a little rogue peanut in here. This is behind the collard greens. That's a Carolina runner peanut. And the okra, same family as cotton and hibiscus. So it has that beautiful hibiscus colored flower, that yellow pretty flower, and will give us the okra pod here in a little while. And then we've got a little more okra next to it, some green okra. And then down the end here, I've opened it up, and I'm going to be putting in some rice. And rice, it's such a huge part of the story here in South Carolina and the Low Country, coastal Georgia as well. It's something that today we almost take for granted. More folks in the United States probably drink their rice as opposed to eating it, mostly in American beer. But at one time, such a huge crop here. So what we do is we get our rice, our seed from the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation. Go search them out on the internet. Fascinating site. I'll tell you about the history. I will say they're leaning more towards the scientific end of things these days. A lot of archaeobotanists and other kinds of things. So if you want to know where all this stuff comes from, they're interested in that. Check that out. But we get our rice seed from them. And so what I've done is I've soaked my seed. And this is what's called rough rice. As you saw Jeff probably processing a little bit the other day, how it can be turned into edible rice. Well, I'm going the other way with it. I'm putting it back in the ground. So what I've done is I've soaked this, and it will actually pip. There'll be a little root that'll start. If you leave it long enough and give it a little bit of warmth, it'll start to pip and start. And that's something that they do today with rice seed, and it's something they did historically. Alston, writing about growing rice, 1807, talks about putting it into a dry tight barrel, meaning its slats aren't watertight, and filling it with water and letting it slowly drain out, and the rice will begin to pip like this. It soaks up that moisture and gets it ready to plant and gets a nice early start. Today, they actually plant rice using aircraft, believe it or not. They'll have it in a slurry. They'll have all kinds of fertilizers and other things on it, and they'll spray it from aircraft, already started just like this. And of course, we're not using any aircraft. We're doing this all by hand. Now, one of the ways we talked about probably growing rice, you might have heard already, the heel and toe method. I'm wearing my shoes, so I will not demonstrate, but I think you can figure it out. Yeah, they do talk about folks in West Africa growing rice. And don't mind our our geese are chiming in a little bit. They have an opinion on everything.
Hold
right?
on, bonus animals. There they are, guys. Every day is bonus animals here at Middleton Bliss.
Says, what is it? Never work with children or animals, right?
That's right.
There you go.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to thank you for joining us from Virginia, from James Island, from Somerville. Appreciate y'all tuning in from Maryland. Hi, we see you. Thanks for joining us.
So we're getting ready to plant our rice. We've started it, we've soaked it, and got it nice and plump and ready to plant. The way they probably were doing this in West Africa, what they call the heel toe, they would dig a little hole with their toe and put some seed in, cover it with their heel, and away you go. And I don't doubt, folks are doing that in their own crop gardens. Enslaved people we know kept crop gardens alongside their quarters where they were growing things like okra and sweet potatoes and peanuts and things. But when you have hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of acres of rice to plant, honestly, I think I'd have a bloody nub by the time I get done. Now there is a quick way. I mentioned earlier how modern rice farming, they put this into a slurry, and one way we know it was done historically was called claying the seed, using almost a wash, almost kind of like a gravy, if you will. Get it nice and wet, and then lay it down, and that clay, as it dries, gets it to stick to the ground. And of course, kind of in the middle is where we go. In our demonstration rice field, we actually put a furrow with a harrow and mark it about every about 10 inches or so is the best, they say. Now, we're not planting down in the rice field, down using our water cultivation, the classic water cultivation of rice. Instead, of course, we're planting up here what we call Upland style. Now, people always say when I do this, they go, oh my gosh, don't you need water? Well, I mean, obviously any plant needs water to grow, but you don't need to grow it in the water. Rice can be grown on dry land, it's fine. The only thing is, just like any grain, and it is a grain like wheat or rye, you have to plant it close together when you're growing it on dry land. Think of the old amber waves of grain, so it'll support each other as they grow, and they don't lodge, they don't get blown over. So, my spacing is a little closer here. Now, this classic water cultivation of rice I've mentioned, that's something that it took about 100 years to evolve. It's something we know Europeans were experimenting with rice growing here in the late 17th century. And of course, folks from West Africa knew how to grow this. They've been growing it since something like 500 BC. But here it's really this amalgam, this mix of the two that begins to evolve through the 18th century and really kind of reaches what we think of as this classic water cultivation by the early 19th century. So let me show you a little bit of what we're doing here.
Really quick, Bob, we did have a question about where you can buy Carolina Gold rice, so can you reiterate about the...
Two things, yeah. Go online, the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation, a wonderful site, support them. That's where we get our seed from. They give it to us free, thank you very much. But also if you want to eat it, there is a great company out of Columbia, which I recommend, Anson, A-N-S-O-N, Anson Mills, who you can get, I don't think you can get rough rice from, but you can get rice grits and pearl rice and all that stuff, fantastic stuff. And for the seed, I would recommend, there's a company called Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. I believe it's SESE.com. They're a seed company out of Virginia, and they actually work with Monticello as well. You can get some there. Also, I would recommend Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds as well, both those companies. And it's something that's become pretty readily available. And if you want to grow big, talk to the Rice Foundation folks, because actually they'll give away a fair amount of seed to small farmers. It's something that is beginning to make its way into local farms these days, of course, because it's supporting the local restaurant industry, which hopefully pretty soon will be back open and booming as it was before. So let's talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of this stuff. You can see I've got laid out here a little bed for my rice. Now, there was a survey of these rice growers back in the 1830s, and the question was asked if they planted on the string, and that's what this is, and most of them said no, they don't. And that's because, of course, you're planting hundreds and hundreds of acres of this stuff. They would mark it with a harrow maybe, and go along and plant. And with the water cultivation, we've soaked the seed, we'll plant. Now, rice will come up through water or through soil, but not both. So in the classic water cultivation, we put it down, whether we clay it or whether we just put it down in the furrow, and then give it about, I like to give it about 24 hours, 18 to 24 hours to peg for that root to take hold. Then flood, what's called the sprout flow of water, and that covers over the seed, really to keep out the predation. squirrels, birds. We have a problem with them. I know back in the day they wrote about it as well. So that water, you put 2 or 3 inches of water over it, keeps all that predation off, and the rice will come right up through it. As I said, here our predation are usually things like chickens and peacocks, so I'm not too worried about them out here. And we will put a little bit of soil on top of these. Again, rule of thumb, when you plant, you only want to plant your seed about twice the depth of the thickness of the seed. So in other words, a nice thick big lima bean seed or something you can plant fairly deep. Very fine seeds like tobacco or something, you really don't even put them under the soil. The rice, as you can see, it's a fair size, so I put it under just a little bit, and all I'll do here is take, and I've already set one furrow, and I'll just put it along in a line. Now I'm going to put it down kind of thick. I'll be honest, the rice foundation is very nice to us, so we've got lots of seed. So I'll put it down fairly thick, and then I will thin it once it sprouts up here. And because I soaked my seed, it'll sprout fairly quickly. I should be seeing some. One of the reasons we're doing this today too, of course, is we're supposed to get some rain this evening, tomorrow. This will help it a lot.
How long did you soak that seed for, Bob?
General rule of thumb is soak it about a day and a half, let it dry about a day and a half. So I let it soak for almost 2 days, and I really haven't dried it out too much. So it's got a fair bit of water in it, which is good. That'll help it a lot in its start. Now, as far as your soil goes, honestly, the soil here in front of the Perry house, we work it pretty regularly, so you can see it's a pretty good, rich soil. It doesn't have to be perfect. We know historic soils. It's pretty amazing the work these enslaved people did working this land. Of course, the early rice fields, as you may have heard Jeff telling you the other day, you're talking in places like cypress swamps, very rich land, but also, frankly, a little bit on the dangerous side, I would say. And it's not, of course, the alligators and the snakes. It's usually the malarial mosquitoes that would have gotten you. And once it's planted, of course, honestly, the planting is fairly easy. Well, I mean, relatively speaking. And the harvesting is not the worst. I really think the maintaining of it is a really hard part. This stuff, it is a grain, like wheat or rye. When it first sprouts, honestly, it looks just like grass. And that's your real culprit. There is, when you read some of these planters' accounts, they talk endlessly of the grass. All this grass that keeps growing in amongst their rice. We know enslaved people have been working these rice fields about a half an acre a day, which is, that's a huge task, I'll be honest. And they would work that plot 3 times. So in other words, work a half an acre, next day another half acre, next day another half acre, eventually go back to where they started, work it back to where they started 3 times to knock that weed down as the rice grew. And once that rice gets to be about 10-12 inches in height, and again it looks just like a grass really, that's when they could start to bring in what's called the long or the lay-by water. And that's where the water now begins to act like a liquid weed barrier. And again, this is your classic water cultivation of rice. We obviously aren't going to do that out here. That's why we're planting a little closer like this. And that water, though, now it becomes not only a weed barrier, it also helps to support the rice once it grows and begins to put its heads, its tassels on in the fall. And rice is a vascular plant. It wants to breathe. So it'll come right up through that water, and like I say, keep growing. And it'll thicken up pretty good. A little bit. But general rule of thumb, they talk about planting rice 10 inches in the row and then 10 inches apart. So I'm a little closer than that here, but that's good. We're going to need that kind of support for it. I do notice, if anyone's noticed, my overseer over here. We've got Arthur working hard here, keeping an eye on us. So I'll finish out this row.
We had a question, Bob, about for this upland rice, this soil rice planting. Do you fertilize the seed?
Well, historically, we know. I always like to tell folks how it's interesting. When you look at the one of the first agricultural societies in America is here in Charleston. And when you look at the list of their books, their library books, there's a book here or there on husbandry, a book here or there on different crops. The books on manure is an end They
There are
were
books.
fertilizing.
There are full books on manure.
Volumes, yes, yes. Fertilizing, of course, this is long before chemical fertilizers. You know, today I would say a good all-purpose fertilizer is fine for this. If you are getting your soil tested, take it to the Clemson Master Gardener folks, and they can get it tested for you. The Agricultural Extension does that from Clemson. You can put it down as a small grain. Usually the soil around here in the low country, you do need to add a little bit of lime, kind of help the pH a little bit. Generally the soil here is a little on the acidic side. And but it really doesn't need a lot. We do know they were rotating. Now they didn't know the exact science of it like we do today. How you plant things like field peas or other legumes to help fix nitrogen in the soil, help the soil structure. All they knew was it worked. So we do know that they would rest land periodically. We talk about across the river road here. We know in our cypress swamp rice fields here at Middleton Place, something like 600-800 or so acres. They're not all under cultivation all the time. They were rotating a bit. Unlike other things like cotton and tobacco where they can't just move west for new lands, here they really are kind of farming in the more European fashion of rotating, resting land, those kinds of things. That wasn't uncommon at all. Again, your chemical fertilizers really coming in post-Civil War. So I've got that one row planted. I'm going to take my my hoe, and I've got a few tools out here with me. Honestly, the old broad-bladed hoe is probably the most common one on these rice fields. Oftentimes a 4-inch hoe. They do have lists in these plantation journals of plantation hoes or rice hoes, corn hoes. They're all a little bit different. So I'm just going to set my row a little bit. I'm going to just kind of work my furrow a little bit right along the line. And again, they didn't usually plant on the string, as they called it, but I'm doing that because, you know, the public comes here. They like to make it look nice and pretty for everybody, which I understand. So I'm making my little furrow here, and I'll plant some more rice. Now, if you're going to grow this at home, give it a try. You know, it can be a lot of fun. You can take the old whiskey half barrel if you want. Pick one of those up at one of the home improvement stores, and you can, once you get it started, if you want to flood it, you can. The rice will grow right through it. Now there are other varieties of rice. This is Carolina Gold, a very old variety, dates back to the 1780s or so, they believe. There's a rice variety called Mirkins. It comes out of the Caribbean, and it's believed to have come from the uplands of West Africa and brought to the Caribbean by enslaved people taken from the low country of South Carolina and Georgia during the War of 1812 by the British and resettled there. And that's an upland rice, and that grows a little bit differently. It also has a little bit different head to it. It has these kind of more like other kinds of grains. They have a little bit of a burr to it to keep some of the predation off. It looks like we got a few horses going out doing a little exercise. That's old Jim going out. So even though you're not here, we're still plenty busy. So I'll plant a little more rice along in my row. Now we know the for a day's task of rice planting, it could be something like 3/4 of an acre or more. The task depends on age, depends on abilities. I don't doubt this is something even children would be involved with to a certain degree, if not directly planting. The enslaved children assisting and bringing food and water and going back and forth. And of course, once it's planted, we do know they had folks who were called bird minders, not just for harvest time, but also keeping them off while it's pegging, while it's beginning to get settled in. Yeah, we should have a pretty good.
Yeah, it's a little breezy all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's nice.
And so I understand how the long flower, the stretch flow, holds up the rice plant as it grows and as the grains get heavy, but how does that work here in the upland style?
Well, what we do with this, because I've planted it close together, and I won't thin it very much. As I said, it's interesting today, they have this, we had a meeting here a few years ago, a conference, of the Rice Foundation and one of the new modern methods of rice growing, what they called SRI, a system of rice intensification. They've done all their research, and they're talking about small plots, small farmers in countries, parts of India, Bangladesh, other countries. They don't do large-scale farming, industrial farming, but to get the best out of their fields, they found planting it 10 inches apart in the row, cultivating it 3 times, and using water to help keep the weeds out and help the harvest is the best way to do it. And
You don't say.
Yeah, that's what Robert F.W. Alston said back in 1807. So.
Right.
So again, that 10-inch thing, that's not only 10 inches apart, but also 10 inches in the row. And obviously we don't have anything like that. I don't think I have a 1/10 of an inch on some of this stuff. So as this grows, it'll really begin to support itself. It'll get pretty thick rows, and it'll get pretty thick and heavy. In the rice fields, we like to spread it out a bit more. By spreading it out and using the water to hold those heads of rice up as they ripen, we get a better yield, more from each pound of seed, because you're able to spread out more over the fields. But this upland style, I mean, it evolves over time, and we know from plantation journals and other things, they're trying a little bit of everything. Some irrigation, some from the rivers, some from the swamps, some anything that would work. Because honestly, these folks are trying to wring every penny they can out of the soil, and frankly, out of the enslaved people doing the work. It really is something that changes this place, and it's something that today, because we don't really understand how vast this rice industry was, I mean, it really changes this place dramatically, in part because of and such, but it's also because, of course, these West Africans, these folks taken from West Africa, brought here, and it's really this amalgam of European and African and a bit of Caribbean, much like the Low Country itself, that still to this day, I mean, even though we haven't grown rice on a large scale since probably about 1900, 1910, it still affects South Carolina and the Georgia Low Country. They did grow rice after the Civil War, but as they grow more rice out to the west, places like Arkansas, things like hurricane floods come in, bring in salt water, and you can get the rice fields back into production once they've been salted, but it takes time and money, and these folks don't have either. And so by the late 19th century, early 20th century, it's pretty much gone by the boards. It's interesting, around 1985 or so, a gentleman up Savannah River, up around Augusta way, read in the New York Times, I understand, it was an article about how LSU had done the research and found that this Carolina gold did come from Madagascar, from the east coast of Africa. And so he starts to grow it really to just kind of keep the seed alive, and started what is today the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation. So now we've got our seed in the furrow, and like I say, you can plant this in a little whiskey half barrel if you want. You can pretty much. So I'm just going to take and cover it over, and I'll just give a little bit of a cover. And then I'll come back with the blade of my hoe and just kind of press it down a little bit. Doesn't take much. And I probably will water this in. That's just to kind of set the seed a little better. If I happen to see a few seeds poke up after I water it in, I'm probably not even going to press them in again. I'll just leave them be. Now in the rice field, when we're planting this wet, I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't cover it over with soil. Remember I said earlier how it'll come up through soil or water, but not both. Down in the fields, I would just walk along and literally press it. Just kind of keep it down in the ground so it'll peg, as I said, or take hold or root over the next 24 hours or so. Now, people often ask what happens to the rice we grow here at Middleton Place. Do we use it in the restaurant? I always tell them it's far too valuable to sell, so we give it away. We actually give it to teachers, to other historic sites. I know a lot of folks who do the tours here like to incorporate it sometimes, and I'll usually leave it on the straw. I'll cut a nice tall piece of it so folks can see what it looks like, and they can use it for demonstrations and instruction, because really this stuff is far too valuable, like I say, to sell, although it is making a comeback. Now there is another variety around today called Charleston Gold, and they tell me that its flavor characteristics are pretty much the same as this Carolina Gold, but it stays much shorter. Now this rice, this Carolina Gold, is an old heirloom variety. It gets pretty tall, about 4 and a half feet, which makes it frankly very easy to hand harvest. But it will lodge easily, that's being blown over, and it uses a lot of water. Modern varieties of rice, like this Charleston Gold, are much shorter, a foot and a half or so, uses less water. And today, modern rice fields, they don't have these big deep banks like we use today. They're just like a little curbstone almost, and they would use much less water, and also they would pump it out to an impoundment and then pump it back in using that same water repeatedly. But by being shorter, again, the rice uses less water. It also doesn't lodge, doesn't get blown over so easily. And when you mechanically harvest, these big harvesters, these combines they use to thresh and harvest, there's less straw, a lot less straw, and a lot less trash as well.
We have a question.
Sure.
In the antebellum era, do you know the relative value of a ton of rice?
Well, I got to tell a story. I'm going to go a little quick sidelight on it. I was down at the one of the historic house museums down in Charleston, and I was asked. I have a card that shows I work in Middleton Place, and so we get to go in free. It's very nice. Highly recommend it. It's a great benefit of working here. And they said, "Oh, well, you work in Middleton Place. You must know about the rice." And so the visitor had a question about rice. Luckily, they asked the right guy, not somebody who's, say, a guide in the house or something. Not like they might not have known, but. And he said, "Well, I was told that these rice beds they have, that the rice was so valuable, they stored it in the posts of the beds." And I was like, well, one, I mean, I have a rice bed too, but I don't know if I would sleep on it and it had hollow posts, I'd probably break the bed.
Right.
But two, I said, from what I know, the value of a pound of rice, up to about 1860, the best year I know of is shortly after the Napoleonic Wars, about 1815, 16 or so. A pound of rice is running about 14 cents a pound.
14 cents a pound,
right.
You guys.
And
so
that's
extrapolate
the
that,
best,
multiply to a ton.
And the cheapest, I've seen some where it's actually a cent or a little bit below a cent a pound. So that's before 1860. So my answer to the poor gentleman asking about the rice bed is I doubt the rice was worth doing all that for. And he said, "Well, you think that guy was telling me a story?" And I said, "Well, you might have misheard him." So and I just kind of left it at that. But yeah, we're talking pennies a pound here.
So no wonder they have to produce millions of
When
pounds.
you think about it, though, 1775, first year of the Revolution, they estimate something in the ballpark of 70 million pounds of rice. So say they're selling it 5, 6, 7 cents a pound times 70 million, and that's their dollars too. That's their money. That's an amazing sum. So it does make these rice growers fabulously wealthy, but it's so labor intensive. The work is never ending, which is what we hear often in these interviews with formerly enslaved people when they talk to them in the early 20th century. Labor never ending. So I've planted my rice. I'm just going to go along and maybe just tamp a little bit just to kind of firm it down. And again, I just use the blade of my hoe to kind of give it a little firmness. And then I'll just come back and I'll probably water this. I'll see how the soil is. Now the other thing about growing the rice, you can't do it when it's too chilly. And that's one of the problems with water cultivation. The water, obviously, if you go jump in your swimming pool right now, and I jumped in mine the other day, it's about 65 degrees. Woo, brutal.
That's brisk.
Yeah. So the soil temperature needs to be much warmer. The soil temperature should be up around the 70s or so. So generally, I do see some planters, they could plant in March, but we've planted early, and frankly, we've had crop failures, where it's just not warm enough, really, especially because in the water, once you start flooding, that cools that soil temperature pretty dramatically. So the upland growing, you could start earlier. You could start, it's much warmer. Now, do these plantations grow it all one way? No. Again, I like to say how these plantation owners, when they keep these plantation books, they talk about all these little different things they do. It's almost like secret sauce recipes. Everybody says you got to add a pinch of that or never add a pinch of that. Same thing. On a plantation, they have hundreds of acres, obviously, and they would grow it in different ways in different places. They would experiment constantly, oftentimes sharing that information with their planter friends. Although I do think some of these journals and things that they keep when they go to these agricultural societies and they sort of start competing. How much per acre are you getting? How many pounds per bushel? I think there's some fish stories involved. They get a little bigger, and you got 10 bushel, I got 20.
Sure.
On and on they go. So not uncommon at all. Well, if anybody has some more questions, feel free. I'm just going to keep tamping things down.
If people really do want to give this a try in a container, if they don't necessarily have a bed,
right?
How much rice could you expect to get? I mean, if we're talking about really growing some rice and maybe trying to put it on the dinner table for a night.
Well, okay, I know it's doable. It's doable. I would say if you take, say, one of these half barrels, you know, you can get, as I said, mentioned earlier, home stores and things, and you know, some good soil. You can put a little clay on top to keep the soil down in there if you'd like, just like doing pond gardening at home, and liberally sprinkle it with some seed, kind of what I did in these rows. You'll be surprised. You'll get a fair amount. You'll probably get, well, I'd say as much rice that's in that bowl and maybe more, almost maybe double that depending. And it will be a little tricky though, as you might have seen Jeff doing the other day as far as pounding and taking the hull off.
Yeah.
But it's very doable. I know I have seen a lot of home mills and things. I mentioned earlier how folks are growing this today. You know, agriculture has changed a great deal here. Now there are still folks growing cotton, peanuts, things like that. Tobacco, we're going to go by the boards. And a lot of these growers, especially close to places like Charleston, Columbia, Greenville even, they can grow this stuff and frankly sell it almost directly to the restaurants. I mentioned Anson Mills earlier. He's not a farmer, he's a miller. He's somebody who processes this stuff. But he'll give away seed to farmers, trying to get them to grow this. And you know, if you can grow it organic and sustainable, which you can, it's probably got a ready market literally right down the street.
How were the prices regulated for rice? Is it auction houses or?
Yeah, pretty much. Now, for instance, one of my favorite examples is the Edmonston-Alston House. I believe it's called that not because Edmonston willed it to Alston, because he went belly up. 1827, I believe. There was the market was always, you know, like it was back in the day. Could change rather dramatically, affected by wars and other things. But pretty much just regulated by the market. It's pretty amazing when you look into some of these systems. A lot of these growers by the 1820s, 18 teens, they're not even really processing on their plantation. They're shipping it down to the city. I always like to tell folks out down along East Bay Street where the cruise ships park these days. There are all kinds of rice mills down there at one time, and they'd ship the rough rice down there to be processed. But oh yeah, quite the international system. Even in the 1740s, they talk about fleets of ships coming up and parking essentially up what's now the Wando area. Fresher water, didn't have to worry about the worms eating up the hulls of ships, waiting for the rice crop to come in the fall. So yeah, it was quite the complex system, but a lot of it done on handshakes and trust. But yeah, it was very wild fluctuations in the market as well, which leads to a lot of folks going belly up. And honestly, these folks are always in debt. Middletons are always in debt.
For the founding nation builders.
Yep. Yeah, not uncommon at all.
Oh, I lost it, Bob. I don't know where it went.
Well, as I said, we are taking a little break on our rice field. I don't know if Jeff mentioned that the other day. Our quarter-acre demonstration field this year. Even before all of this virus stuff came up, we had decided to give it a little bit of a rest. It's been about 20 years we've been growing rice on our little quarter-acre demonstration field. And so this year we're going to re-engineer it a little bit, kind of change up the rows a little bit. Honestly, go back in a way to the way it looked about 20 years ago. You know, it seems like we've learned the hard way. We tried a lot of different things. We realized, oh, the first way we did it was pretty good. So in the meantime, too, we'll probably, for the summer, we'll probably put a crop of field peas in there. The field peas, of course, they would fix nitrogen in the soil. They're great for building soil structure. And historically, of course, they would have used the field peas to feed some of the enslaved people. A lot of times after they'd harvested, they'd let the cattle into fields like that to eat the greens and turn the soil and drop a little bit of manure around too. Not a bad thing at all. So we're going to be trying that. I don't think we're letting the cattle loose in there though. We'll probably just plow that under a few times.
We have a question about, was there a rice mill at Middleton Place?
Ooh, it's a touchy one. Well, there is a mill at Middleton Place. Down on the water, of course. You may have seen it. It still stands today. It was burnt, we believe, 1865 when troops came through. But if you take a look at Dr. Porcher's book, Dr. Richard Porcher, P-O-R-C-H-E-R, we say Porcher. It sounds like it should be pronounced Porcher, but he talks about the milling of rice here in South Carolina. I met him a few times, and one time he said, there's not a rice mill down there. And he's probably right. That comes in the 1850s. I know 1850s up to about 1860, Middleton was experimenting with different crops here. We know he had cotton growing at one time down in the fields along the river. Don't tell anybody that, that'll just confuse them. But no, I don't believe it was a rice mill. We do know they had pumps and other things, steam-powered pumps on the other side of our property here. But I believe, my educated guess would be that being this close to the city, frankly, it's economically more sound just to ship it down to the city to be processed.
Sure, especially in the quantities that these properties
now,
here
if you
are
talk
producing.
about places like Hoboni, which was a place that Middleton here in the 1840s and 50s was managing down on the Cumbie River, that was his brother Edward's place, that I believe did have a mill, and it would make sense being way out there, milling it. And probably, you know, when one of these places had a mill, they were probably milling rice from other plantations nearby. Not everybody, you know, needed their own mill. It's something you could, you know, and when you did mill, you might take a certain percentage, you know. I'll mill your rice for you, but I'll take 10% of the poundage or 7% or what have you. That wasn't uncommon at all. So really not a need so much for a mill here. If you go farther afield, though, you go way up the upper reaches of the Cooper River or out on the Cumbie, probably much more common to find some mills out there. Here they could just send it to the city.
All right. Well, if y'all have any other questions, please do drop them in the comments thread there, and we'll do our best to answer them later on. But Bob, so we're gonna have to come back and check in with you as these plants grow, huh?
Hopefully they'll leap right up here. We'll see. I will say Jamie does a great job with his other crops here, and I won't catch up for quite a while. But yeah, by the fall we should have some nice thick rows of rice here, and I'll be honest, you know, come the fall, and definitely we'll have to check back, you'll see these beautiful golden heads of rice begin to form, and they're quite attractive. They're really pretty, and hopefully we'll have a nice little crop this year that we can share with other educators and interpreters here in the Low Country.
Great.
So definitely check back in.
Yeah.
Fun.
And we'll make sure that Plugged Into History comes back and checks on the progress of the rice growing. So don't worry. I know that we're not open yet, but even if you can't join us by the fall, we'll check in with Plugged Into History here. So no worries. All right. Well, let us know if you have any other questions. Otherwise, this has been On the Farm Wednesday with Bob. And Bob, thank you so much. We really
I appreciate y'all
it.
joining us. Stay healthy. Plant a little rice, have some fun with it, you know?
Yeah.
It's kind of fun stuff. You never know. See what you get.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate you staying plugged into history. We will see you tomorrow at 11 a.m. for Hands-On History with Sid. We're going to go over into our nursery and learn a little bit about proper methods and tips and tricks to plant trees and shrubs in the spring. So if you want to plant some trees and shrubs in your yard or in your beds, come on back here, right here to Facebook tomorrow at 11 a.m. and you will get some information, tips and tricks from our VP Horticulture, Sid Frazier. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. And like Bob said, definitely stay safe and well, and we'll hope to see you as soon as we can. If not here in person, then at least online.
There you go. Thanks for joining us. Take care. Stay healthy.